Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Homestead, and welcome to part 2 or part B of our lecture on the rise of labor during the Gilded Age. As always, take a moment to jot down the lecture outline and pay attention to those key terms at the left. And with it, let's begin. Now, when we left off last time, we were talking about that workers have had enough, because how much did life suck in the Gilded Age? Oh, let me count the ways. Poor work conditions, long hours, low wages, child labor, wealth inequality. We left off, of course, with the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. And one of the legacies of this was a growth of actual organized labor unions. And one of the first major unions, and it's not the first union ever, because unions have been around for centuries, right? Because most often they were known as guilds, and they were known as usually skilled craftsmen guilds. And so only people who did a certain craft, skilled labor, people who made swords, they were part of a guild, sword-making guild, right? Those were very common, but those were very finite, very particular, and not a lot of people were allowed to belong to them. So you had to be a part of the guild. What is different here in the Gilded Age is they began to expand and say, no, because skilled labor is becoming more obsolete. I mean, it's still important. Yes, I'm not saying it's not. But there are so many hundreds of thousands of workers who are unskilled, everyday wage laborers who have no voice and need help. And one of the first major unions to try to organize them was a group known as the Knights of Labor. Now, the Knights of Labor, you see it here. This was founded in 1869 by Uriah Stevens in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Now, Uriah Stevens is not the name I ever think of whenever I think of Knights of Labor. He does start the first major national labor union. The name I usually think about is this man right here, Terence Powderly, because he's the man who takes the Knights of Labor public in 1879, basically on the heels of the Great Railroad Strike. And in the wake of the Great Railway Strike of 1877, the Knights of Labor membership explodes rapidly. So, what does the Knights of Labor actually believe in? Well, first of all, they oppose the wage labor system. So the whole labor system, they don't like, because they see it as an oppressive system that only benefits the elite. The second thing they are for, their platform, is that they want to organize both skilled and unskilled labor by industry. So forget this crap where, well, I am a skilled person who can turn steel into whatever product, or I make the machine. No, they said, forget that crap. Instead of trying to, have this massive union for everybody, that doesn't work either. Instead, so you all make steel. Skilled, unskilled, doesn't matter. You all work in the steel industry. You should organize together and form a union of steel workers. You work in the oil industry. So all of you should make a union to, protect your rights in the oil, because that way you know what your specific needs are. And then he gets radical. I mean, really radical. He wants to include both men and women in this. I mean, whoa, right? Give equal access to women. Even more radical, he is not racially discriminatory. In other words, he welcomes African Americans as part of the labor union. Now, let's be fair and clear for a minute here. Terence Powderly welcomed all. He was the head of the Knights of Labor organization on top. When you get down to local chapters of Knights of Labor, like individual, factories or individual, industries, some of them were a little more racist. But as a whole, the Knights of Labor was racially inclusive. They also wanted some strange, weird things like an 8-hour workday, equal pay for women. They wanted the abolition of child labor and a graduated income tax. Now, I would hope all those things are somewhat common to you because those are things that we all kind of agree on today for the most part. Some will disagree with the graduated income tax, which means some that the richer pay more than the poor. They don't think it's fair that everyone pays the exact same percent or the same dollar amount, that rich people should pay more than the poor person does. That's graduated income tax. There will be some disagreements among you on that one, but the rest of them, 8-hour workday, equal pay for women, no child labor. I mean, these are all fairly common sense things in today's standards. Where he gets really radical, I mean, seriously, where we can't even agree. I mean, we all agree today, okay, African Americans and women should be allowed. That was radical back then, but not today. What is still radical for today, what he wanted? He called for the public ownership of railroads and to form what he called, or was called, worker cooperatives. What is a worker cooperative? Well, a worker cooperative is where workers would actually own the means of production rather than slaving away for corporations who make all the money while they get nothing. Let me explain what this means to you. Then we'll go into what it is. This is still a very, crazy, out there, radical concept even today. So here's the deal. Let's just say you have a job. Now let's see. Let's say you have a job at, let's just say Pizza Hut. I used that example in the last lecture. I'll use it again. So Pizza Hut. You're a really good model employee. You make sure that every pizza is made correctly. You treat every customer with a smile. You do your job exceptional. Is there any benefit to you? Is there really a chance for promotion? No matter how hard you work there, is there really a tangible benefit to you? Well, let me put it a different way. Now again, please don't accuse me of not being grateful for my job. It's not the situation. I'm using this as an example. I'm a teacher, right? My wife also works in high school. So I'm going to use us as an example for a minute, right? I'm a professor, I'm an instructor, I'm a teacher. My wife's also a teacher. I have a question for you. Let's say in the high school, a high school teacher. No matter how hard a teacher works, no matter how high a percent of their students pass the STAR exam here in Texas. Let's just say, for instance, the teacher has 100% of their students pass the STAR exam this year. 80% of their students pass their AP exam. Those are off the chart phenomenal numbers. What every teacher strives for, at least, right? Is there any tangible benefit for a teacher accomplishing that? Because ultimately it's not the teacher accomplished it, it's the students that accomplish that, right? The teacher did their job. They provided the students with, information, content, skill, had them do repetition, had them learn it. That teacher will be lucky to even be told by their principal, hey, good job. There's no promotion. There's no wage increase. There's nothing at all tied to their performance. So no matter how hard or how little that teacher works. So for instance, a teacher is contracted for 40 hours a week. They work, say in a high school setting, from 7 a.m. to 3 p.m., 5 days a week. There's a 40-hour work week. But they go home and bust their butt every night to get a new lesson plan ready for their students next morning. They bust their butt and spend most of their weekend, say 4 hours on Saturday, 7 hours on Sunday. They spend their weekend grading papers, providing feedback for their students. And they do this all for the love of the students, right? It's for the students, right? Guys, there is no benefit. Other than, yes, you care about the students succeeding, there is zero tangible monetary benefit for doing a good job or an average job. Yes, if you do a really super poor job, you can get fired or not, you're kind of not renewed. But there's no benefit. So why then is there an incentive for a teacher to work harder? I know your answer, you're thinking all yourself, it's for the students. It's the right thing to do. Well, sure, great, it is. But that does not put food on a family's table. When you get a job and you work at Sonic or you work at Panera or you work anywhere, think about that for a minute. No matter how hard or how little you work, is there any real chance of promotion? Is there a benefit to you? Now, in some businesses, the harder you work, you may get a promotion. Yes, there's a possibility. But the majority of jobs in our country are not built that way. There's no real place for growth. And teaching is one good example of that. Therefore, what Terence Powderly and the Knights of Labor argued was, no. This is wrong. Instead, they wanted what's called worker cooperatives. Now, let me give an example of a worker cooperative. In 2014, my wife was pregnant, we took a road trip out to California. We did Disney, it was great. We drove up Highway 1, it was beautiful. And we stopped at Berkeley, at UC Berkeley, right across from San Francisco, and we spent a day there because I had to research my dissertation. Like I went through a bunch of archives, I photographed a bunch of stuff, and got some information for my dissertation. And of course, while I'm there, we were like, okay, this is great. It's someplace new. Let's try something new to eat. So I got out Yelp on my phone. Oh, this looks good. It's a pizza place that they only serve like 2 types of pizza every day, but it's got great reviews. So we go there. And I'm sitting there. We had some really good pizza, by the way. It was great. It was phenomenal. And I'm sitting there looking at the place and thinking, man, this is different, I started looking at some of the different things on it, and I was taken back by the fact that this business had no owner. It's not a franchise. This is not a single sole proprietor owner. No. This was employee owned. So again, I didn't have all the details, but say there's 5 or 6 employees. If there's 10 employees, doesn't matter. So there's 10 employees. They each owned an equal share in the business. So therefore, theoretically, again, conceptually, if the 10 of those employees work harder, they will reap more benefit, thus more profit to split between the 10 of them. If they work not as well, they do an average to below average job, they will reap fewer profits and or lose money. But if they all work super hard together, they innovate, they be creative, they make new things, they make better pizza, they will draw in more crowd, and thus they will make more profit and split it among themselves. That's a worker cooperative. The people own the means of production, they own the product. In other words, the harder they work, the more money they make. And of course, contrary, if they work less or work lazily, they'll get less money or not have a job, they'll be pushed out. Now, this concept of worker cooperatives goes by another name as well. It is theoretical communism. Now, this is very important to note. This is theoretical communism. Now, communism, as you've all been taught, you will be taught it later on this semester. Of course, we see in the USSR, we see in China, we see elsewhere in the world, Cuba. That was never what Marx originally intended for communism. Theoretical communism was that there would be no government and that the workers themselves would own everything and everyone would be equal. And of course, the harder you work, the more profit you can get and you'll share the rewards. That was theoretical utopian communism. It has never existed and it will probably never exist because, generally speaking, people are selfish. They vote to do the best for themselves rather than the best of the community at large. So, and again, this becomes one of the reasons why labor unions become branded as radicals. Because they are promoting this radical idea that, by the way, is still radical today, of theoretical communism, but branded not as communism, but as worker cooperatives. Now, I'm not sure how you see it right now because you listen to the video versus me, in class face to face. But I know from experience that this actually makes a lot of sense to people. Again, theoretical, not in practice. But the idea that the harder you work will get you more reward should make sense here. But nonetheless, like it is today, it was back then, it was branded a radical idea, and thus the US has had a long history of anti-labor sentiment. Now, the Knights of Labor will enjoy a number of wins during the 1880s. As they will win some small strikes in local factories, again, very local, but they will increase their membership from 100 to 700,000, so 100,000 to 700,000 members in the early 1800s. But that all comes grinding to a halt in 1886. Why? Haymarket, Chicago. You see, while the Knights of Labor was indeed radical, they were not trying to overthrow the government. They were not trying to end, our Republican ideals of democracy. But there were some who were promoting a much more violent and radical agenda. And these were known as anarchists. Now, Knights of Labor were not anarchists. They were not trying to get rid of the government. But there were a group of individuals who were more radical, known as anarchists. What are anarchists? Well, it's the belief that government itself is an abusive device utilized and exploited by the rich and powerful to exploit the working class. Let me repeat that again. Anarchists believe that the US government, or governments in general, were an abusive device that were exploited and used by the rich and powerful to oppress and exploit the working class. Now, do they have an argument here? Well, during the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, remember, Rutherford B. Hayes called on the U.S. military to support the big businesses. The big businesses basically called, hey, Mr. President, can you help us out here? And the president said, sure, send in the military and put down and exploit the workers and make them suffer under lower wages. Well, the idea here is that their goal of anarchists was the eventual disappearance of government and create a stateless society. This is far left-wing libertarianism here. They believe that this could be accomplished, though, not by voting, but through revolutionary action among the masses who would rise up and overthrow the government. These are anarchists, right? These are more radical. And one of the hotbeds for this labor activity of anarchism was Chicago. Now, in Chicago, there was the labor movement. Yeah, there's labor movement there. There was a huge socialist labor party there as well. Now, we'll get to socialism later. But socialism does not mean overthrow the government. The American Socialist Party, by and large, was not trying to overthrow anarchists, but rather use the government to reform. Now, we'll discuss that more later. And then number 3, there was the anarchists. Now, all 3 of these groups were seen as radical by mainstream, politicians, mainstream public, and even many in the media. This anarchist party, they were part of the Socialist Party. They kind of spurred off in their own direction because they were more radical. They were too radical. And these groups, now, and some things they all agreed, right? Anarchists, Socialist Party, labor unions, they all agreed on one basic thing. Workers were being exploited, things need to change. On the other side of things, their big opponent here, yes, was the business owners, but the business owners relied on the Chicago police. And the Chicago police were notoriously violent and harsh against labor union organizers. And sure enough, this is where our story begins here. On May 1st, 1886, the Unions and Socialist Party of Chicago called a general day of strike. So all across the city, workers need to strike in protest of poor labor working conditions, poor wages, the usual list. And during this strike, the Chicago police were called in to break up the strikers. And during this skirmish in front of the McCormick building, the police killed 4 of the workers who were striking. Again, they were striking peacefully, but striking illegally according to law. And the Chicago police come in, rough them up, and kill 4 of them. That was May 1st, also known as May Day. Now, in the aftermath of this, 4 workers are killed. That's sad. That's tragic. 3 days later, on May 4th, on May the 4th, anarchists organized a general protest meeting. Now, so May the 4th, 3 days later, anarchists hold a second meeting. This one is primarily designed to protest the killing of those 4 workers. So not only are they railing against the business owners who treat workers and exploit workers, they're also railing against local government and specifically the Chicago police. They have speakers, they have shouting, they have blowhorns, they give their speeches, and they get ready to go home. The meeting's over. They are dispersing, the crowds are breaking up, and then arrives the Chicago police again. And the Chicago police begin to disperse the already dispersing crowd. Now, big surprise, this instigates violence. This will ignite a confrontation, and someone from the crowd throws a homemade pipe bomb right into the crowd of police officers. And then it kills 1 and wounds several others. The police now open fire on the protesters. Again, they were already dispersing, but now they're engaged because the police showed up. The police open fire, setting off a wild melee. In the end, 10 end up dead, 6 of whom were police, and 50 are wounded in the ensuing melee. Now, someone's got to pay for this, right? And it's not going to be the police because, well, they're the police. 7 anarchist leaders were arrested and sentenced to death. Now, I'll repeat this. Why are 7 anarchists arrested? Remember, the crime here is throwing the bomb, the homemade pipe bomb. That's the crime here. So you're looking for 1 person, maybe a second accomplice, who threw the pipe bomb. But the Chicago police arrest 7 known anarchists and sentence them to death with no evidence that ties them to the bomb thrower. Now, of the 7, 2 would be reprieved. 1 would commit suicide in prison. And 4 would be hanged. So 2 would get off. But 5 ultimately are dead. Their only crime, they're being anarchists. And again, they weren't committing any crime by speaking. They were protesting peacefully until the police showed up. But this violent incident turns public opinion against labor unions, such as the Knights of Labor, despite the fact that Terrence Powderly publicly denounced the violence. But 1 of those 7 convicted anarchists was a member of the Knights of Labor. And therefore, the Knights of Labor were branded anarchist, even though they weren't. The Haymarket Square riot, as it became known, set off a wave of hysteria against labor radicals and labor unions, dividing the country. It cripples the Knights of Labor. Because even though he denounces it, people associate in their minds, in the media, Knights of Labor, anarchist, and the picture you see on your screen, violence. The result, and again, this is when you add to that radical ideas like worker cooperatives, communism, it sounds a lot like social anarchism, socialist or anarchist ideas. Now, I told you they had 700,000 members since 1886. Within 4 years after Haymarket, they were back down to only 100,000 members, and they die off pretty quickly. Now, just as the Knights of Labor were being in decline, another major labor union would take its place, known as the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, which, by the way, is still around today, though they are now known as the AFL-CIO. But that's a story for another time. You see, they're founded in 1886, but they are merely a collection of craft unions representing skilled laborers. Notice the difference here. Knights of Labor welcome skilled and unskilled. Bring them all together because they're all workers. The American Federation of Labor only invited skilled laborers. If you're an unskilled peon worker, screw you. You're on your own. And so this is a much more conservative union. It only employs or only allows in skilled individuals. It also wasn't very top-down. Each individual union was a separate entity that kind of fell under the conglomeration of the AFL. It grows very slowly at first, but by 1890, it is larger than the Knights of Labor, who had fallen down to 100,000. And by 1900, they're up to 500,000 members. And pretty impressively, by 1920, they're up to 4 million members. It sounds impressive until you realize that that's less than 15% of industrial workers that they represent. It was a very kind of elite-minded organization. Not only that, they are not racially inclusive. They are not welcoming of women. And therefore, they will never have even though they're still around today, they don't have that impact that Knights of Labor was trying to make. They don't have that radical agenda, which is why they are able to stay around. Because as we're going to see in our next two examples, things are not getting better during the Gilded Age. Because there are two more major incidents of strikes during the Gilded Age that will further demonstrate how little hope the average working class unskilled worker had during the Gilded Age, when their only hope was to rely on the so-called good graces of their boss for safety and their livelihood. The first strike we're going to discuss is the Homestead Strike that took place in 1892 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. You see a picture there. Now, if you remember correctly, Homestead, which is, by the way, just 7 miles southeast of downtown Pittsburgh, was the crown jewel on the Ohio River of Andrew Carnegie. He had purchased it in 1883, and had grown it into his burgeoning steel empire. So 1883, he buys it, he develops it. By 1892, though, we're going to have a showdown. Because it was a full-fledged city, company town. And what I mean by company town is you lived there, you worked there, you ate there, you slept there, you entertained there, you died there. So here's the picture from the outside, but here it is. Oh, that's not so bad, is it? They have this little housing you can live at and pay, of course, their rent. Here's even a daycare for you. Those kids look happy. Of course, a Nickelodeon, by the way, not the kids' channel, but rather a entertainment house. Gotta have a saloon, get drunk after work. Don't they dress so nicely? You gotta love these propaganda images. Oh, that's why. This is how the other half lives. Yes, and that thunder you hear in the background only exemplifies this point. This is how the other half lives. Yeah, they're smiling all right, but they're playing in essentially a sewage runoff here. Dirty water, polluted by the factories. I've never known how to react to this photo. It's a cute kid, smiling. Look how dirty the child looks. So even though he's smiling, that's how the other half lived. Now, I come to this picture right here. Why? Well, Andrew Carnegie designed Homestead as a company town where you could live, work, breathe, eat, etc. there. All the amenities were there, churches were there too. Living conditions ranged But it was the conditions of the city, the filth, the dangerous job conditions, the poor pay, that would lead to labor unrest. Enter this man, Henry Frick. Now, Henry Frick had been running Carnegie's coal mine operations, and he became Carnegie's right-hand man, specifically pulled to deal with a homestead situation. Now, Carnegie, for his part, was kind of sympathetic toward worker plights. Like, he had a soft spot. Remember, he was a self-made man himself, grew up poor, immigrant, right? So he had a little soft spot for the poor and for the working class. So he wanted some help dealing with his labor situation in Homestead. So he brought in his right-hand man, Henry Frick. Now, to put it mildly, Frick is a prick. You see, this man, to prove himself an elite, wealthy man and prove himself on par with the Carnegies and Rockefellers of the world, he bought himself a private men's country club that was on the top of a mountain on the other side of a small dam and bridge. The only way to get to this resort, men's club, was to cross a small bridge on top of a dam, which was fine. Everyone loved it. It made him feel equal to all the elites of society. Then Frick decided to get a new horse and carriage, well, a new carriage. And this new carriage was too wide to fit across the bridge that ran top of this dam. Now, any decent human being would get a different carriage, but not Frick, because he's a prick. Frick decides to go order, not ask, order the mayor of the town below the dam to widen the bridge so he could run his carriage over top of it to get to his men's club, his country club, his resort. And because the mayor had very little recourse, he's forced to do so. When he does this, it makes Frick happy, but it makes the dam unstable, and when a big rain came through, the dam broke, flooding the town, destroying people's houses and lives. Yes, that's Henry Frick. So what does that have to do with Homestead? Well, this is the man that Carnegie puts in charge of Homestead. And basically, Carnegie realizes he needs to cut wages again, or wants to keep his profits up. But he doesn't want to be seen as the bad guy. And so Carnegie puts Frick in charge, and he goes off on a little holiday back to his homeland of Scotland. Now, some may say, well, Carnegie didn't really know what was happening here. He just put Frick in charge and washed his hands of it. I don't buy that for a second. Due to, you're the owner, you know what's going on. And number two, we'll see in a minute how they end their lives. So this is during an economic downturn. This was a deliberate, concerted attempt to break the steel union. It was trying to force higher wages, better work conditions. And so during this economic downturn, Frick demands that workers pay for profit losses by taking wage cuts. But he didn't do it right away. He knows what's going to happen if he enforces a wage cut. They're going to strike. So what Frick does, because he's a prick, he doubles production in the 2 weeks leading up to the wage cut and the subsequent strike, stockpiling manufactured steel goods. This way, when he does cut wages, they go on strike, he can still sell stuff for the next 2 weeks or a month in this case. He doubled production. And big surprise, he cut wages, the workers call strike, and they walk out on the job. What does Frick do? Remember, he's planned for this. This is a concerted, planned effort. He forms what's called Fort Frick. Yes, really. And so basically, he builds a fort around the steel mill to lock out the workers and prevent them from re-entering, protect private property, yes, but as a way to force them to allow in what's called scab laborers. You bring in these new laborers who were not part of the workforce and use them as what's called scab laborers. They're non-union workers. And therefore, he needed to force the striking workers to leave the grounds to invite in these scab laborers. So he builds a fort to protect the property, and now he's got to get rid of the workers themselves. So he calls in a group known as the Pinkertons. Now, the Pinkertons were established back in the 1850s. They were a private security force established by Alan Pinkerton. And their basic job, what they became known for in the Gilded Age, was breaking up strikes. Essentially, they were hired goons. Basically brought in, hired to come in and rough up workers who were striking. You see them here. Strikers are preparing to fight against the Pinkertons in Homestead. So they're hired by Henry Frick. And on July 6, 1892, 300 Pinkertons attempt to land via barge on the Ohio River to rough up and disperse these workers. The strikers are ready. You see it here. And they begin to throw fire bombs onto the barge. The workers do. They make makeshift grenades, fire grenades. And a firefight erupts between the Pinkertons and the strikers, leaving 7 Pinkertons dead and 9 strikers dead. Despite this, Frick will refuse to negotiate, refuses to meet with the Union head. And after the Pinkerton raid, there will be an attempted assassination on Frick's life by a radical member of the strike team. He will survive this assassination attempt despite being shot twice in the neck. Again, grazing bullets granted. He was shot twice in the neck and survived. But this violence caused by the Pinkertons' arrival is very important, because now it says, oh no, wait, there's violence? Oh no, now let's call in the military. And the Pennsylvania governor is going to send in the Pennsylvania militia to preserve the peace, right? And they are there to entrench themselves, protect private property, and engage the strikers if provoked. So they are willing to fight the strikers if necessary. And ultimately, the militia will finally disperse the crowd after 95 days. After 95 days, Fort Frick will hold, the strikers will lose. And this bloody affair was a dramatic and significant event for labor unions. It underscores, again, that labor strife. It also hardens the response of owners against strikers. That's one example. A second example is the Pullman Strike. Now, Pullman, if you don't know what it is, it's Pullman, Illinois. It's another company town. Again, you work there, you live there. In fact, by the way, in Pullman, Illinois, it was required as a prerequisite for employment at the Pullman Company, you will also live there in their company-owned housing. Now, if you know what Pullman is, Pullman was the maker of train cars, right? But these weren't just any train cars. Yeah, they made mundane train cars too. But they were known for making the most exquisite, first-class traveling train cars in the country, possibly the world. And employees at the Pullman Palace Car Company, it's a railroad company, but they make palace luxury cars, train cars. So you work there, you must live there. They will pay you in script, so or in credit, so you must shop there. And the prices, by the way, are more expensive from the company-owned stores. But to make matters worse, in 1894, this was a full year into another recession. There had been a panic of 1893. The company had laid off 3,000 workers out of a total of 5,800. So more than half the workers had been laid off. The rest who were still working, their wages were cut by 40%. But yet, the cost of goods and rent remained the same. So hold on. You're laid off. You hope to have your job back. Those who still have a job saw their wages cut by 40%. But yet your rent is still the same. No reduction there, no forgiveness, no protection. And the cost of goods in the store is still the same. Big surprise. Workers weren't happy. And what the last straw became when 3 workers said, hey, can we organize, again, workers are unified. Can we discuss, negotiate some kind of deal here to make things better for workers? Better wages, a reduction of our rent, something. Immediately, those 3 workers who went in to negotiate were fired. This became the straw that broke the camel's back, and workers began to walk off the job. Most of these members had joined a group known as the American Railway Union. This railway union was founded by this man right here, Eugene Debs. Now, Eugene Debs was an avowed socialist. He was. Now, he's not trying to overthrow the government. He's not an anarchist. He believes that you can use the democratic government and use it to reform and regulate the worst excesses of capitalism. And he's a radical labor leader, yes, he's a socialist. But he gets involved directly with this negotiation of the American Railway Union against the Pullman Company and tries to negotiate between the workers and the company. Now, it refuses. The union workers stop working, they go on strike. Now, this is a big deal. This halts railway transportation in the Midwest. Strike breakers are brought in, scab laborers, are Pinkerton-style goons. Now, Debs, for his part, said, guys, strike. We need to strike. We got to do this. But one important rule, whatever you do, do not destroy private property. Because if you do, then the military will be brought in and we lose. So Debs was being smart here. And it was going pretty well for Debs. The strike was going on. No military, no intervention by militia yet. Until the owner of the Pullman Company called up his good friend, the President of the United States. Not to bring the military in yet, but instead to connect Pullman engine cars, so Pullman train engines. And he got the president to allow Pullman engines to pull the U.S. mail cars. So transportation has been halted, all transportation because of the strike. But one thing still goes through, that's the U.S. mail. And in case you didn't know, it's a felony to tamper with U.S. mail. And so the owner of the Pullman train company convinced the president, his name is Grover Cleveland, he convinced Grover Cleveland to allow the Pullman cars to pull the U.S. mail. Which means now, if there's any interference, stopping those cars from traveling is a felony offense. Again, this is this is smart by the Pullman Company. It's also highly suspicious of the U.S. government because, remember, laissez-faire, hands off. No. Laissez-faire only meant government will not help workers, the average American. Government will, however, always help the rich, powerful business owner. And so in response to this, workers will begin to burn. So here you go, just a picture of the rail cars. And you see the picture here, they begin to burn the rail yard. Angry workers after the mail car change, where they begin pulling the mail car. Despite Eugene Debs' plea, the workers began to destroy the rail yard and set things on fire. Once they did this and destroyed private property, the next month, President Grover Cleveland sent in federal troops, which of course caused more rioting. 12 more people would die in the violence, and ultimately the strike will be called off. On the same day, by the way, I'm sure this was pure coincidence, I'm sure, but the strike is called off the same day that the court system in Illinois will cite Eugene Debs for interfering with the mail and send him to jail. Now, please get used to Eugene Debs, used to his face and his name. He'll be back, and don't worry, he'll be in jail again. Now, despite these horrific atrocities, these were bad, right? And business owners realized they had a PR issue here. There's a public relations issue. People are dying, workers are striking, they're hungry, they're fed up. So how do business owners respond? Now, at the end of our last lecture, we talked about the idea of social Darwinism, right? Anyone can be Andrew Carnegie. Now, there are some here, like Eugene Debs, who are arguing, no. Maybe the government should step in and help regulate and reform and make things better for the working class. Then there was Andrew Carnegie. Now, Andrew Carnegie in 1889, he wrote an essay known as The Gospel of Wealth. And basically, this was his response to the plights of the Gilded Age. Remember, how much is life suck in the Gilded Age? Let me count the ways. This is Andrew Carnegie's response. And in this essay, his autobiography, he writes and presents ideas that advocate that the wealthy use their excess non-essential wealth to be used as a public trust for the community. In other words, he asserted that it is the responsibility of the upper class, these wealthy industrial capitalists, these self-made men, to pursue philanthropy for the benefit of their communities. Now, the cynical person would say this is all a response to how badly the Homestead Strike damaged his reputation. But to his credit, he put his money where his mouth was. Because after he sells his company, his steel company in 1901 to J.P. Morgan, he will devote the rest of his life to philanthropic pursuits. By 1919, when he dies, he will have donated or entrusted 90% of his wealth to several different various Carnegie foundations, such as Carnegie Hall. Now, I don't know when the working class ever goes there, but it's a cool, artsy thing. Again, world famous. Carnegie Mellon University. He will help fund, the Carnegie Foundation will help fund more than 2,500 public libraries, including 32 here in Texas. Unfortunately, only 5 remain, but he helped fund museums, playhouses. Again, so he did some good with his wealth. This is what he advocated, that rich people need to basically give handouts to uplift and improve their society. But do these things really tangibly help the working class? They're nice for entertainment. They're nice for value. Yeah, again, nothing wrong with these things. They're great. But are they really helping the general public? And again, the cynic may say he did all this to assuage his guilt. And the reason I say this is because on his deathbed, he sends a letter to Henry Frick. Now, they have not really spoken. They've been at odds since the strike, the Homestead Strike of 1892. So for 30 years, they've been kind of on the outs. They haven't spoken in 20 years at least. And on his deathbed in 1919, Andrew Carnegie sends a message to Henry Frick, a letter. His personal secretary delivers it to Henry Frick. Henry Frick opens it, he reads it, and asks Henry Frick to go meet with Andrew Carnegie. Again, they're going to bury the hatchet. It's been 20 years. He's on his deathbed. He just wants to, make amends here. He wants Henry Frick to come and meet him because he's going to die. Henry Frick responded saying, quote, "Yes. You tell Carnegie I'll meet him. Tell him I'll see him in hell. That's where we're both going," unquote. Again, leading credence to the idea that Carnegie knew what was happening in 1892 at Homestead. And so, yes, he does some great things near the end of his life, no doubt. But is that enough to make up for what he did to his workers? Now, I want you to know this idea of philanthropy is alive and well today. We talk about it all the time, right? The idea of trickle-down economics. We talk more specifically, though, about how rich people use their excess wealth for philanthropy, to do good in their communities, right? And the question is, how much of their wealth really goes to it? So I got this list here for you. It's 2018, a couple of years ago. Jeff Bezos, worth $160 billion. He would give 0.1% of his income to philanthropy, to charity. Warren Buffett's the best on the list, obviously. He's at 3.9%. Look at this list of people here. So this became known as the gospel of wealth, that rich people have a duty to give their excess to help those around them, uplift the poor, to benefit them. But as it didn't work back then, it didn't solve the ills of the Gilded Age. It was still a bunch of gold-plated crap. These numbers don't exactly paint a rosy picture for present day either. And so maybe, just maybe, it'll take more than that in the Gilded Age to fix the problems. But unfortunately, before we get there, things are going to get a whole lot worse. So for our next lecture, we'll talk about immigration and urbanization, how things were in the big cities. But until then, until next time, take care and bye-bye.